Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Ryan Berg, and I'm a senior fellow with the Americas Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Thank you for joining us today for a conversation on responses to the challenges faced by women migrants in the Northern Triangle. And a special thank you to the Taipei Economic and Cultural Representative Office, also known as TECRO, for supporting this event. Before we formally begin, let's take care of some logistics. We expect this event to last approximately 90 minutes. Following the panelists' remarks and a moderated discussion, we will field questions from the audience. We ask our audience to please submit questions by clicking on the Ask Live Questions button on the event webpage, or simply type your question into the Q&A section in this webinar. Today, we will have simultaneous interpretation. At the bottom of your Zoom screen, please click the globe button that says Interpretation, and then select the language you wish to listen in. Ahora en español. Hoy tenemos interpretación simultánea durante el evento para nuestra audiencia hispanohablante. Si desea escuchar el programa en español, por favor, haga clic sobre el icono del globo que encontrará en su pantalla y que dice Interpretation, y elija español. Finally, please note that this live stream discussion will be recorded and will be made available on the event webpage within 48 hours of this event. Again, good morning. Thank you for joining us today for the conversation on responses to the challenges faced by women migrants in the Northern Triangle. Women from El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala face a multitude of security and economic challenges that have been exacerbated by climate change and the COVID-19 pandemic. On top of gang violence and violence related to drug trafficking, women from the Northern Triangle face extreme levels of gender-based violence. In Latin America and the broader world, some of the highest femicide rates are reported in Honduras and El Salvador. In Honduras alone, there were 227 cases of femicide in 2020, and other sources report that on average, there is one woman killed every 23 hours. Women face higher rates of poverty, higher rates of unemployment, and lower participation rates in the labor force. This is aggregated by the fact that opportunities for women are often found in the informal sector, where they are subject to lower wages, longer hours, and poorer working conditions. These dynamics compound with other social pressures to hinder women's economic independence in the region. Economic pressures have been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Food insecurity, for instance, has risen dramatically in the past 2 years. As of October of 2021, the World Food Program estimates that the number of food insecure people in the Northern Triangle grew threefold to 6.4 million from 2.2 million in 2019. The COVID-19 crisis has compounded with climate change, which has led to crop losses and natural disasters, accounting for a significant economic contraction in the Northern Triangle. The IMF estimates that these two factors have played a large role in contracting Honduras' economy by nearly 9%, El Salvador's by 7.9%, and Guatemala's by 1.5%. Today, our discussion focuses on some of these root causes of migration for women in the Northern Triangle, and how the international community can cooperate to empower women and find long-term solutions. We are very fortunate today to have with us a panel of 4 excellent individuals. Our first panelist is Dr. Ana Leticia Aguilar-Thyssen, head of the Secretaría de la Mujer in Guatemala. In this position, she is responsible for contributing to public policy that impacts the lives of millions of Guatemalan women. In the past, she has held various roles with other Guatemalan government and international cooperation agencies and civil society organizations, including Guatemala's Ministry of Planning and Programming, Guatemala's Ministry for Food and Nutrition Security, the United Nations Women Program in Guatemala and Panama, Plan International, and UNICEF. Our second panelist is Secretary General Timothy T.Y. Xiang from the International Cooperation and Development Fund of Taiwan. Secretary General Xiang has a distinguished career in foreign affairs, serving in various official positions in the government of Taiwan. Previously, he served as ambassador at the Department of Policy Planning at Taiwan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as representative of Taipei's commercial office in Kuwait, and as Deputy Director of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Department of Economic and Trade Affairs. He also worked with Taiwan's World Health Organization Task Unit, the Department of International Organizations, and the Department of West Asian Affairs. Our third panelist is Diane Carrasas, who is currently the Regional Director for Latin America at CARE. Ms. Carrasas has over 20 years of experience in international development, humanitarian relief, poverty reduction, and public health programs, and has lived and worked in countries such as Paraguay, Ecuador, Bolivia, Panama, and Honduras. Prior to joining CARE, Ms. Carrasas held various positions with private sector companies and has worked with international NGOs like Plan International, Food for the Hungry, and the US Peace Corps. And our fourth panelist today is Rachel Schmidtke, who serves as advocate for Latin America at Refugees International. Previously, she's worked at the Mexico Institute at the Woodrow Wilson's International Center for Scholars on Migration, Asylum, and Refugee Policy for Mexico and Central America. And at Duke University, she conducted research on migration from the Northern Triangle. Rachel has also worked at the World Bank Gender Group, United Nations World Food Program in Peru, and USAID in El Salvador on gender and women empowerment projects. I am grateful to all of our panelists for being here today. And with that, I'd like to give the floor over to Secretary Aguilar. Thiessen, over to you for your opening remarks.
Muchas gracias, buenos días. Primero, agradecer por invitarme a sumarme a esta reflexión importante que estamos haciendo, vamos a hacer, sobre la situación de las mujeres migrantes de la frontera norte. Quiero disculparme si tengo problemas de afonía, pero estoy saliendo apenas de COVID y eso me provoca un poco de problema, así que me disculpo de antemano.
I just want to apologize. And I want to greet everyone here today, and I'm very glad to be here in this very important panel. And thank you to all of you that are hearing and participating with us right now. I just want to talk a little bit about some topics that are related to the context of the issues that all the migrant women are going through because of the COVID pandemic and has exacerbated all of these impacts or previous impacts that the women were going through because of their situation and condition in regards to gender issues in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. It's evident, like our colleague mentioned, they're suffering. They are going through lots of issues because they're always in the front, and they were in the front line and COVID, and now they're suffering from unemployment, and because of the pandemic, they're suffering a lot. And you know that the region has a greater participation, and the participation that women have in the workforce was really worrisome before. And now, only 5 of every 10 were part of the workforce, and they were just working in the community or teaching, but mainly the women that were participating in the workforce were doing domestic jobs, and 90% of the women that were working in the region had domestic jobs, and they are also exposed to a great impact financially because there's still a great gap in the region in regards to the salary of women because it's lower than men. And it's a small percentage, but it's significant to all the countries in the region. And this is something important that we can see in a general way. In 2019, unemployment was at 3.4 and 14.8 for women, and for men 2.0. And we can see with these percentages that there's a huge problem for women in this regard. 5 of every 10 women, like I said before, were affected in regards to employment because of COVID, and the participation of women that were working at domestic jobs. Unemployment in the region went down, and the employment conditions were really or are really bad, or the conditions are really bad. In Central America, 7.6 of these women work as independent contractors, and there was an increase in regards to the petitions of asylum in the US, and the majority of the migrants were from El Salvador, Guatemala in second place, and the estimates say that the social conditions and violence in these communities of these three countries, the countries that we're talking about this morning, contributes to migration, especially women and girls. And we all know that the pandemic has produced the collapse of response of the government to health issues, and also to the population that has been affected by COVID, and that also increased other issues that were very important in regards to cultural problems that were already really bad, and health issues. And that's how they were affected even more. And I want to say that poor women, indigenous women from Afro descendants, and that were already marginalized, they were the ones that didn't have access to all the services. And with the pandemic, this increased. And the access of different services like potable water, and this is another issue that is very complex. Health issues, and also different conditions that they were under, and of course the vulnerability to be infected by COVID because of the lack of different health services. In regards to food security, they were also impacted, in women especially, in the reproductive age. They didn't really have lots of opportunities. I also want to mention, because I think this is very important, and it has to do with the conditions in which the women are migrating, is because of violence. We also saw that they were impacted with the pandemic, and the violence increased in our countries tremendously. Also, pregnancy among teenagers, because women and girls were basically locked up with their aggressors, and we saw how much it increased. This problem increased a lot, and migrant women and refugees could experience a lot of violence because of the isolation and confinement in different refugee centers. And you know that different countries have a very high percentage of femicides, and for every 100,000 women, in El Salvador, 6.8 women, 5.1 in Honduras, in Guatemala, 8.0, and these percentages were there before this pandemic, and there are a lot of cases in which these women were already survivors because of all the problems that they had in regards to gender. And I think women in transit are very vulnerable, and lots of these
Many
women
of these undocumented women already come from these contexts that we have pointed out, but a great part of them want to migrate to the US, and the situations that they go through in their trajectory obligates them to be stationed or remain stationed in countries in the border areas of Guatemala and Mexico, where there's you could say a hub of women that are stationed without access to social services and without access to formal work or dignified work. We don't know the exact conditions that these women are facing, but we do know that they are also in vulnerable condition along with their children and their sons and daughters who are also lacking a dignified quality of life. And many of them are also exposed to child trafficking, work, or sexual exploitation. There are important elements that we have to keep in mind also that have to do with for 2020, there was an increase in migration for men and women, and there was a change in roles for women in migration dynamics. It's important because they went from being wives, daughters, sisters from migrants to being active subjects of these migration flows and being the main providers for their homes in the three countries of our interest. Women migrate looking for new social opportunities and new economic opportunities like the rest of my immigrants, a better quality of life, a personal life and family life. And it represents basically 52.83% of the total of migrants in the region. That is greater than half. And this increase of participation from women in migration flows was a response to important elements that have to do with this new generation and consolidation of networks, social networks, and new trends also in migration routes that is necessary to keep in mind. And there's also an important point that is very interesting to include in the debate that has to do with migration being multifaceted something that requires a comprehensive approach that has multiple layers. It can be for women to migrate. We don't know what exactly causes, just one thing that causes women to migrate, but we know that these causes like opportunity, work opportunities play an important role, a very important role in women's need to migrate, also in the need to escape violence in all its manifestations, but particularly against violence towards women and also against poverty. And an important factor that I think we are having an important emergency in a regional context, that's one of the main reasons women travel, is the disasters and the need to find factors for community and family resilience. This risk factor when they travel informally in the way that they enter the work market in their destination. And another fundamental point is the continuum of violence, because if these women were victims and survivors of violence in their countries of origin. Throughout the transit, they had to face violence that specifically targeted at them, the children and daughters, and then continue being in these violent situations in the countries where their destination countries. Doctor, yes.
Very much for these remarks. I'd like to move on to the Secretary General's opening remarks, and we will come back to you for more comments. It'll be very interesting to see what the other panelists have to say and how that fits with the very important issues that you've put on the table this morning. So thank you very much, Dr. Ana. Leticia Aguilar. I want to move over now to the opening remarks for the Secretary General. And I want to wish you a very happy evening there, and note that he is joining us in a very different time zone. So thank you very much for being with us, Secretary General. Over to you for your opening remarks.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Berg. Fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and good evening, because here is already past 8 a.m. It is my honor to join this significant event today and addressing the issue of women migrants in the Northern Triangle. I would like to briefly introduce what the Taiwan ICDF has done in the countries in Northern Triangle, namely Guatemala and Honduras. Taiwan has devoted to work with partner countries for their social and economic development. As the Professional Foreign Aid and Development Agency of Taiwan, the Taiwan ICDF has dispatched technical missions abroad, supporting partner countries through the projects in the areas of agriculture, public health, education, ICT, environment, small and medium enterprises. Based on the local condition and the needs, appropriate tools are being employed, which include technical assistance, financial service, capacity building, etc. In Guatemala and Honduras, the projects implemented by the Taiwan ICDF are in the areas of agriculture, SME, and the public health. In these projects, women are said to be the main target of beneficiary. Here I share some examples. In Guatemala, the bamboo industry project from 2014 to the end of 2021 has organized various bamboo craft training courses for women's organizations. Women could learn skills of making bamboo furniture and could have a chance to develop micro business, which might improve their family finance. The project also provided bamboo seedling and guidance on bamboo planting. In addition to technical coaching, the project also assisted in product sales and market linkage, so the women have the ability and opportunity to take orders for production and establish a stable production and sales operation. To the end of 2021, more than 560 women have been benefited. In Honduras, farmers' organizations' production and marketing enhancement project, setting half of the targeted farm organizations should be female ones. It analyzed operational efficiency of targeted farm organizations and provided customized counseling and advice. Assisted female farm organization developed processed products by matching raw material and help farmers enter wholesale market and supermarkets. In the last 2 years, the COVID-19 pandemic has brought tremendous impact on people's livelihood. Women have become even more vulnerable as economic inequality became wider due to the pandemic. In order to address the predicament of women in the Northern Triangle countries, the Taiwan ICDF offers comprehensive education and training opportunities by providing women with vocational training to boost their employability, providing government officials with training related to policymaking to create a women-friendly environment, and providing the youth with scholarships for higher education to cultivate socio-economic talents in the region. As for vocational training, it is not only offers opportunities to learn skills, but also provide trainees with allowance to compensate for the financial loss during training. The trainees who complete and excel in the training programs can receive funding and start up consulting service that those who want to start their own business can leverage. The training programs mainly center around the micro business, such as food and beverage, beauty treatment, hairstyling and design, and e-commerce. So far, almost 400 female participants attended the training program in Guatemala. In Honduras, around 450 women have participated. After 2 years of spread of COVID-19, the post-pandemic recovery has become the main concern of countries. Except for the project introduced above, which trying to mitigate the impact of a pandemic on economic vulnerable women, the Taiwan ICDF has conducted a regional program assisting the economic empowerment of women in Latin America and the Caribbean in the post-pandemic of COVID-19. It includes financial service and credit guarantees. The Taiwan ICDF is collaborating with the Central Bank for Economic Integration, CABE, to support women who want to start a business, women-owned micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, or MSMs with a majority of female employees in Guatemala and Honduras to obtain the funds needed to maintain and reactivate the business operations and retain women's employment and increase income, so as to enhance women's economic empowerment. It consists of $60 million loan, which will be co-financed with CABE and relent by CABE's network of financial intermediaries, and $10 million credit guarantees and technical assistance to enhance lending from financial institutions to women entrepreneurs and MSMs. From UN's viewpoint, many women migrate in pursuit of work or education opportunities and the possibility of a better life for themselves and families. Lack of access to livelihood and resource is also one reason that drive women to migrate. The issue of migrant women reflects the problem of women's vulnerability in the social and economic environment. As a foreign aid agency, the projects implemented by Taiwan ICDF provided women with the opportunities of accessing the resources to improve livelihood for decreasing economic inequality, which we may offer an example of possible and partial solution. Taiwan committed to improve social and economic status of women in our partner countries. Through the problem solutions above, we expect women and girls in the area will be self-sufficient and empower their lives. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Secretary General, for your opening remarks. We appreciate those very much. Over to Diane for your opening remarks.
Good morning, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be part of this panel for such an important problem about migration of women from Central America. And one of the things I really want to underline is this is not a Central American problem. This is a human problem. And this human problem affects all of us. It affects us especially in the Western Hemisphere, but it affects us in the world. And because it's a human problem, I kind of want to make it real for these few minutes that I have. And I want you to just imagine that you're a 15-year-old girl from Honduras. Your name's Maria. You've been out of school for the last 8 months. You're out of school because things got difficult in your town and in your school. And there was a threat of violence and sexual abuse to you. So your family thought it was best that you not be in school. Fortunately, you and your family were able to receive some services from the UN and INGO community. You received services in relation to safe space. You also received some vocational education around dressmaking. Your family actually received some help in psychosocial and also in violence prevention. Your family, because of their participation in these programs, received some much needed cash for the 8 months in which you were involved in the program. You are now making a small salary as a private dressmaker. So your family consists of you, your mom, your 2 siblings, and your father left 6 months ago, despite the fact that he was in the program. When he lost his job as a truck driver, he couldn't control his violence and became violent very violent against your mother. One of the things that happened after that was that the family needed to move. There was fear about the father's violence. So the family moved to a rural area, living with an aunt, and your dressmaking salary immediately shrank. So you started doing a small garden to help feed the family, but actually the water was scarce, and so it was limited in what it was able to produce. Even though your mother received psychosocial support, you're really worried about her and your siblings. Your family, though, is worried about you. You've been noticed in this new area, and there are gangs, and there is pressure, and there's some fear about something happening to you, sexually or violently. So your family wants you to go and live with a cousin who lives in Texas and works in the hotel industry. There's a job waiting for you, and you could potentially earn six times the salary that you could earn in Honduras. They've paid your family has used some of the money from your dressmaking and gotten money from other places selling things to pay someone to have you go to Texas. They've also gotten you protection against getting pregnant should you be attacked on the road. Imagine that you are her, Maria. Imagine that you are her mother. Imagine that you are her sibling. Imagine that you are her father. Everyone's suffering. So the plight of young girls migrating to the U.S., as Dr. Ana Leticia mentioned, has really increased from Central America. Right now, the statistics are 7% are between 12 and 13 years old. 28% are between 14 and 15 years old. And 78% are 16 and above. Imagine what it is like for a 15-year-old to have to go through this. And despite the fact that this family was receiving really good help, despite the fact they still felt the need for the oldest daughter to migrate. So in working in CARE and other organizations, one of the pillars is agency. And so you can see that Maria, in this case, got some work on agency. She got some work on self-concept. She got some work on earning a living. And certainly that has been helpful for her, but it's not enough alone. Another big important piece is also strengthening local civil society. And you can see that she got services, her family got services, and that's really, really important, and it's not enough. And the other important pillar is about structural reform. And that alone is not enough. And just the INGO sector or the UN sector or the local government or foreign governments working alone on that is also not enough. This is a human problem that affects a hemisphere, that affects a world, where together we really need to come together and work in a coordinated fashion to make the kind of impact that we need to make for the lives of young girls, mothers, and families to be productive and healthy in the way that they deserve. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diane, for those opening remarks and for really concretizing and humanizing what we've been talking about thus far. Very, very much appreciated. Rachel, thanks so much for hanging in there with us. Over to you for your opening remarks.
Thanks so much, Ryan. Thanks, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. So my work at Refugees International often entails speaking with women who were forced to leave Northern Central American countries due to conditions beyond their control. So I'm often speaking with women once they've been displaced from Northern Central America, typically taking a very emotionally, physically, and economically costly journey north with, unfortunately, a very low likelihood of being able to enter into the US. And while each country context is different, Honduras, Guatemala, Salvador, all different countries, I do hear many similar stories from these very courageous women. And often their stories highlight situations of violence that they've experienced at the hands of their intimate partners, of police, of gangs, of other people in their community. Many also speak of the lack of work that they have, how the minimum salary often doesn't sustain for the family basket, for example, or how COVID devastated their situation economically for nearly 2 years, and often the precarity of the informal work that they have. And so like Diane, I'm also going to tell a story of one woman that comes to mind that I spoke with back in 2020 that I think encompasses a lot of the aspects that women face in the region. So I met a woman named Ileana. She is a single mother from El Salvador, and I met her in 2020 in a migrant shelter in Guatemala, and I've continued contact with her over the years. And she was estranged from an abusive husband, and she had 2 children. One was around 9 years old, I think, and the other 4. And she migrated with them to the United States, hoping to find a better life. And she made it to the US border, actually, after a very grueling and dangerous journey, and unfortunately was deported. And so when she returned to El Salvador, she went to work in a factory, but it had very low pay, and her mother had to watch her kids part-time. And unfortunately, the factory had a gas explosion, and she survived but was injured. And, she lost her job in that and was left without pay, high medical bills, and unfortunately, no one to watch her children full-time because her mother could only do it part-time. Once she recovered, the COVID pandemic hit, and she was no longer able to find formal employment anywhere. And so last I spoke with her, she wants to leave El Salvador again to the United States because she's had a very difficult time finding opportunity and safety where she's living. And I think this story, unfortunately, I think highlights a lot of the barriers that women face in finding, not only opportunity, but safety and support at home. And I think these cycles, unfortunately, will continue without more access to justice, especially, she was a woman who was fleeing an abusive situation from her husband with no protection from him, without opportunity, finding employment that is not only formal, but also dignified and has worker protections and safety in her community. And I think ultimately equality. Many of the panelists have already highlighted that women in particular face such distinct, often barriers to integration into work and to finding safety because of, cultural stigmas, of the cultura de machismo, of expectations that women have, of lack of reproductive justice, of many things that women specifically face. And so, thankfully, I think there are solutions to these issues, and I'm so glad to see my fellow panelists, working so diligently to better conditions for women in Northern Central America. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing more. So I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel, for your opening remarks. I want to remind our audience before we get into the moderated portion of today's discussion with the panelists that if you have questions, you can submit questions by clicking on the Ask Live Questions button on the event webpage, or just simply type in your question into the Q&A or chat box in this webinar. I want to go to have a sort of lightning round with our panel, where each person gives about a 2-minute response. And I wanted to drill down a little bit more and get to a more nuanced level about the differences between countries in the Northern Triangle, because we've talked about the Northern Triangle as being sort of 3 countries generally lumped together. But I want to talk now about some of the nuances and some of the differences. So if you could each comment on a few of the commonalities, which you've done already, but also on the differences. What separates El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras in terms of women migrants, things that they're facing, root causes of migration? And I'm cognizant of the fact that, Rachel, you waited the longest to speak. So let's go in reverse order back around the table.
Sure, Ryan. So I will say, as of late, the majority of people that I'm seeing here at the U.S. border, for example, or in Mexico who've migrated are typically women from Honduras, although we do see many women from El Salvador and Guatemala as well. But I think some of the distinctions there is, and this is a colleague of mine, Eric Olson, has talked about this in the past, but I do see a situation in Honduras in the past, maybe not so much now that Xiomara Castro is as a president, but really of a situation of very, very low opportunities for any kind of economic support. The poverty rates there are very, very high. I think the highest of the three Northern Central American countries. And I think he's mentioned this thing about sort of a lack of hope, that there's a very difficult situation in terms of trying to find not only opportunities to work, but the violence factor, which is of course common in all three countries. But I think it's been particularly devastating there with the two hurricanes that happened last year as well. It's just been sort of a confluence of factors. So I do see a higher percentage of women from Honduras coming currently. And I think in terms of other differences, I'm sure our other colleagues from Guatemala will have more to say on this, but I think the intersectional identities, particularly of Indigenous women, that is much higher prevalence in Guatemala. And I think Indigenous women in particular face additional barriers of discrimination and racism and difficulty in accessing work in their language and like formation in terms of education and other things like that. So they're facing double burdens in many ways. So I think Guatemala, the Indigenous factor, is quite an important one to highlight. And then I think the political situation in El Salvador has left many women in a difficult situation in terms of political representation and things like that. So each country is very different, but those are just some of the highlights that I wanted to bring in. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Diane, how would you think about some of the differences between countries in the Northern Triangle? Help us get to a greater level of nuance here.
So Rachel kind of stole some of my thunder, certainly mentioning the Indigenous population, which is much more prevalent in Guatemala, which makes things different, although statistically, I think less likely statistically to migrate. And then, of course, the political situation in El Salvador, which is so complex and so unpredictable, I think is the word that comes to mind for me at this time. And the level of poverty and violence in Honduras is certainly a driving factor, with a lot of hope that a lot of people have about a female president, as Rachel mentioned. So those are some of my thoughts for right now.
Thank you very much, Diane. Secretary General, how is the ICDF thinking on a nuanced level about some of the differences between Northern Triangle countries? I welcome your thoughts on this.
From ICDF to ICDF's perspective, honestly, I would say, well, just based on the political situation or economic development, probably it will be the same to us, because the projects I mentioned earlier, well, basically they address the issues, probably the same. I mean, either in Honduras or Guatemala. So for us, it's not easy for me to address the issue, but basically the projects we implement in those triangle, we take the same approach, the same way of addressing the issues, because to us, probably is the common. That's not so different to us. So probably I cannot add more, to these issues. Sorry.
Thank you, Secretary General, for your viewpoint. I want to go to Doctora Ana Leticia Aguilar for any comments on the differences between Northern Triangle countries. And in particular, I'd welcome your comments on Guatemala, of course, since you're working so centrally in this position.
Sí, gracias. Bueno, brevemente porque ya se
Thank you
señalaron.
so much. Well, I think that we already talked about the main problems, but I think that the differences are
la capacidad de agencia y la capacidad de
the response capacity, the agency, and governance in when it comes to the problems in the three regional governments. They're different because the advancements and the public policy measures that have been implemented in each country have a behavior that you could say a different behavior. There are countries that have a longer breath in their answer to the problem, some that have less and more or less strengths and ways to answer these problems. I think these are important elements that mark a difference. And the other thing, in Guatemala's case, Guatemala, it's becoming more of a destination country, not just for transit, but a destination country in all of the territory, especially the northern border. And we have difficulties and huge challenges to provide an answer to these situation, and we have to work among the actions being developed, include political action exclusive to provide social services and protection to these women that are staying behind for or staying in the country for various reasons. I think those are two important differences.
Thank you so much, Doctora, for some of the nuance there on what makes Guatemala in specific different from other countries in the Northern Triangle. I want to move to a question about education, because for so long, I think education has been such a critical component of this conversation. The Secretary General mentioned vocational training as something that the ICDF is funding. It's clearly been an important part of the conversation and continues to be an important part of the conversation. But we've seen recently in Northern Triangle countries that women have made strides in education. And in fact, some of the rates coming out of the region show higher school completion rates than men, but this doesn't necessarily translate into better economic opportunities. And so I think we need to start reevaluating the idea of education in women's empowerment. What other legal and cultural barriers are we talking about? Some of you have touched on this already, of course, but what are some of the other legal and cultural barriers that exist hindering women's access to opportunities? What can be done at a policy and cultural level to address this issue? And this is another question on which I welcome comments from the entire panel. And I'll start in reverse order this time with Dr. Ana Leticia Aguilar and go back around in the other direction.
Bueno, yo quiero decir sobre este tema que me
Well, I
parece.
want to say on this topic that I think education remains in the center of the answer to this problem with migration or irregular migration particularly. I think it's still in the core of this conversation, but I do think there are important challenges when, as my colleague mentioned, when areas related to imaginary or cultural practices, when what it means to be a man or a woman in these societies, our societies, there's still a series of practices and sort of settings that including exclusion that we need to work on and take on. There's a series of actions, I believe, and challenges that we face as far as communication goes to change these behaviors. It's necessary that we take on more and better initiatives to communicate, inform the population on this particular topics. And of course, we need to review, and because an important part to keep in mind is that each country in the north are part of agreements, international agreements that defend human rights for women and women immigrants, and we need to develop more aggressive action to control these conventions. And so we need to do a more in-depth analysis in developing regional initiatives that there are some within the Central America integration, especially with the Office for Women or Women Ministries that do affect female immigrants, but we need more, especially those linked to possibilities to identify a series of laws and public policies that are missing. Where are these gaps? Also, what conditions exist within these frameworks that are limiting and creating obstacles for women to migrate? I believe these are fundamental elements that are at the core of these discussions, and also diversification of educational options for women. We need to diversify education options. It cannot be that we still have, even though we have higher or improved levels of elementary education participation, we have still low high school participation, because the traditional high school educations in these environments need to be diversified. We need to give women options for employability, to be entrepreneurs, system processes in education, that be they formal and informal, to grant them access to nutrition, for example, in for example, how to manage the internet or how to use the internet, and they don't have access to this. And I think these are very important challenges along these lines, my colleagues.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. I want to go over to the Secretary General. You've mentioned vocational training in your opening remarks. How is the ICDF thinking about education in the region and the role education plays? Sorry, Secretary General, I'm not sure if you heard me. Did I have a bad audio connection?
Yes, not very clear. Sorry. Well, I think if you just asked whether the education itself, well, just based on my presentation, we found actually education is probably the key that's going to support vulnerable women to achieve something. So why we mentioned the vocational training, because through the vocational training, when the women, they have the chance to learn the skill, then it's possible that they can change the status in economics, and probably it will help them to support the family. They can have a more stable income. So education definitely is a very important element if we're talking about the issues that we're talking about now. So of course, in the ICDF's projects, vocational training is the most important one, especially when we are addressing the migrant issues, because we know the migrant issue definitely come from the one reason is economic equality, and because the other panelists already mentioned other factors. But if we can support these women, through education, then education probably is the only way to change their fortune. So, well, the ICDF always take the education programs very seriously.
Thank you very much, Secretary General. Diane, I want to ask you an iteration of this question. It's really the second part of the question that I proposed, since both Madam Secretary and Secretary General said education remains the key. then what are some of the policy and cultural issues that we can address so that education can become the key driver? Give me some ideas on what we can do on a policy and cultural level to make sure that education plays the important role that the other panelists have mentioned it's going to play.
Thank you. I think it has to do with availability of jobs, rate of pay, and preparing people appropriately for the kind of jobs that are available. And fourth, thinking about it in a Western Hemisphere context. So it's interesting, in parts of the hemisphere, we're saying we can't find people for jobs. And so what about, working together with the private sector and with government to have kind of a temporary guest worker program? I think historically that has been something that has happened in the Western Hemisphere for a long time. And I think that's one thing to consider. Another thing to consider is programs that have been really successful in the Western Hemisphere with communities of people who have been left out and have received specific training and tremendous opportunity to move into the private sector. One program that comes to mind is A Year Up that has gone, that is a very successful program in the United States. So I think if we think about it maybe in new ways, and we think about rate of pay also being something really, really important in the whole process, I think there's all kinds of possibilities.
Thank you, Diane. And Rachel, your thoughts on the role of education and what we can do from a policy level to address some of the remaining political and cultural barriers to make sure that gains in education play the role that we know that they will play in women's empowerment.
Sure. So I think on the cultural side of things and on the policy side as well, I do believe that access to family planning mechanisms and reproductive justice is absolutely fundamental in this case. So let's say you're a young woman in the Northern Central American countries and you have your high school education, but you get pregnant at 18. It's quite difficult for you to be able to take care of a young child as well as put your education to some sort of use in a full-time formal employment. So I think being able to plan for a family and when you have that family is absolutely fundamental. I think apart from that, of course, there are, unfortunately, this is not unique to Central America. This is a global issue that I think there are expectations of women to be the ones to stay home to take care of children. So until that sort of cultural environment changes and that there's more equality in terms of childcare, I do think that women are going to continue to face disadvantages, even if they do have higher rates of education because of sharing the responsibility of childcare. So I think that's a big issue. And of course, again, access to reproductive justice is something that is quite limited in Northern Central American countries. We're facing it now here in the United States, but this is something that I think is also a huge barrier. And then secondly, I would say, again, kind of painting a picture of this, let's say you do have an education, but in your community, the main type of employment that is available to you is, in agriculture sector or working as a domestic employee or something like that. I think others have mentioned this, but there needs to be a higher availability of jobs and jobs with a competitive salary, because again, doing the work that I do, I will be very frank and honest that, the salaries in the United States or even Mexico are much, much higher. And so the pool of wages as well as family reunification and again, safety and access to many freedoms is going to be very difficult to combat unless salaries and things like that increase. And I agree with other colleagues that investing in more private sector partnerships and policies that can encourage the creation of more, again, dignified jobs with higher salaries and benefits and things like that is definitely going to be the key. So, education, of course, is fundamental to accessing those jobs, but education is just one sort of step in, I think, a larger process of being able to stay in your community and be able to live a dignified life.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And you mentioned jobs. I want to come right back to you, Rachel, because my next question is about jobs and particularly about formal sector jobs, because as has been mentioned in this conversation thus far, women are far more likely to work in the informal sector. So I want to come back to you right away and ask, what are some of the policies that you think can bring more women from some of these more vulnerable jobs in the informal sector into the more formal sector, where, as you mentioned, there's dignified work, there's a better pay, there's some protections in case you get COVID or in case you become disabled and unable to work. Talk me through some of the things you're thinking about and seeing on the ground in terms of formality.
So this is going to circumvent the question just slightly, but I do think, honestly, the key to this is reducing corruption and access to stronger institutions and things like that. I think until those types of issues are addressed, it's going to be very difficult to increase, investment in social programs, investment in different public sector job opportunities and things like that. So I think first and foremost is strengthening institutions, reducing the level of corruption, and being able to really invest the money that many of these countries have into the creation of better jobs, into the creation of more educational opportunities and things like that. So I know that's not quite exactly what you asked, but I do think that the reduction in corruption is definitely one big issue that I think needs to be kind of at the heart of a lot of these programs. And then again, I do think utilizing the private sector is important. I have one colleague from El Salvador who stated, governments, may come and go, but the private sector always remains. So I think utilizing that stabilization, the stability of that sector to our advantage would be very important as well. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Rachel. Diane, your thoughts on bringing more women into the formal sector? How can we do it? And what are some of the things that we should most be considering?
I think what Rachel was saying about the private sector is totally true. And, putting gender at the center in the private sector. And that's part of what we do with CARE. We put gender in the center, and we have gender marker framework for private sector, and in the PCA program, that is a huge contribution that we are making. And it's so important because it's a win-win. It's a win for the private sector. It's a win for women and their families. And it's a win even for the local government. So I think it's high time we put gender at the center instead of what we have been doing in the past. And certainly what Rachel said about waiting to have a family when you are ready to have a family, and the whole issue of childcare. And that can be incorporated also into the private sector.
Thank you, Diane. Over to you, Secretary General. How is the ICDF thinking about formality? It's been something you've mentioned in some of your remarks. What are some of the aims of the ICDF in terms of formality, some of the programs? I want to give you a chance to respond on this important topic of bringing more women into the formal economic sector.
Well, I think if you want to bring more women to the formal job, right, or the private sectors to play a role, yes. But still, I want to emphasize that our viewpoint is just like the vocational training, because if the woman needs to be in the formal job, they must have a skill to be fitting in the needs of private sectors. So from the beginning, we think only make the women to be employable. So whether they can increase their skill or they can, based on the training, they can equip themselves with a certain, just like a skill, that can be used by any sectors, and then they can enter formal jobs. They can become join the formal economy because only they have a very stable income. They can lay them to rely on the system themselves. Otherwise, they cannot be sustained themselves. So we still want to emphasize the education, the vocational training. Probably is I would not say the only way, probably is the best way to support women to enter the formal economy system.
Thank you, Secretary General. And Dr. Ana Leticia Aguilar, can you give us a sense of how the Guatemalan government is thinking about increasing opportunities in the formal sector, specifically with a gender lens?
Sí, yo creo que es
I
importante
think that it's important to have in mind that we see important steps, not only in Guatemala, but in other countries in regards to develop these actions so that women can enter the formal sector. And I think a very important step has to do with recognizing the steps that we have seen to recognize the importance of different jobs, that it's important to recognize the importance and the impact of this in different countries in the region, but also to move ahead and after recognizing how important this is and redistributing all these jobs or all these care jobs and reduce them so that the government takes charge of this social reproduction. And I think this is one of the most important steps because it's going to make sure to provide women with formal jobs, with protection for them and for their kids. And they're going to also give them access to different services to support them so that they can take care of kids. Women are not only the main caregivers, but now they're tutors also for their kids without having access and the condition to be able to do it because they had knowledge. They didn't have knowledge of the digital world. And we're working on that right now to strengthen these areas. But there are other aspects regarding offers that the country has right now to be able to strengthen and modernize their public services regarding employment. And I think this is very important to do for all the countries because we're talking about here, not only about national employment but also to have regional standards that can make sure that these women go into the formal sector, and not only women, but society in general. But this requires to have very important efforts and to reorganize all these services and to implement different actions and programs that are very specific for women so they can start working and to review norms and standards so that we can help women to enter the formal sector. This is a transition that will take time. It cannot be done in one day, and we need to take other actions in regards to norms, to creating new policies regarding these different types of work after the pandemic. And there's another thing that is very important to talk about. This has to do with having better and more programs to support women when they enter the working sector and to concentrate in educating them about their rights. Like my colleague was talking about equity and gender also, and to have in mind that women have different life cycles, because employment is different depending on the cycle of each of these women, but not only regarding the different cycles, but also having in mind if they are indigenous, if they live in urban or rural areas, or if they are from low income or medium income. So we need to have in mind all these factors to be able to help them in the private sector and enter the formal sector. And of course, in regards to education and vocational programs, we need to talk about this process to be able to educate them for their jobs, for their work, and it's needed. And we need to identify first which are the needs of different companies of the private sector, and then to create all these educational programs, and that they have in mind all these women. So I think that's very important. And this digital gap that exists right now in our countries, it's really a great burden for women, especially. So they can learn, they need to learn how to use technology, especially in regards to language. And this is a great challenge right now. So to be able to implement all these programs, educational programs, technology, teaching them how to use the technology and partner with the private sector for this initiative, to partner with different private companies. In Guatemala, we have a coalition to empower women right now, and the private sector is very important, is key, so that the private sector helps women because they know how important this process is. And overall, they go to different territories, and the potential of all these women to enter the formal sector. And we need to create more projects so that the family is more stable. And we're not only talking about surviving. It's important to keep creating different opportunities so that poor families not only survive, but we need to support women so that they can be independent financially. And I think that's the most important thing. If we formalize the jobs for women, then we're going to advance and we're going to create the autonomy of the women, and it's a win-win. The country is going to win, and we're going to prevent irregular migration, and we need to support all these procedures, and we need to organize all this so that women do not keep migrating. So we need to identify all this organized migration too. And I think that we're taking great steps right now, and we need to keep working and keep partnering with other private companies. So that's what I wanted to say.
Thank you very much, Doctora, for mentioning those. And you've segued very nicely into my last question before we open up to Q&A. So this is a last reminder to audience, please insert your questions into the Q&A chat box or go to the website and click Ask Live Questions on CSIS event webpage and type in your question. We'll get to Q&A in 1 second, but the Secretaria mentioned international cooperation and in engagement across organizations as a key component to this. And so I want to ask one final question, which is, what can be done to improve coordination and cooperation among different actors on women empowerment in the Northern Triangle. And I want to start with you, Secretary General, for your thoughts on ways in which organizations can cooperate more effectively in this region.
Thank you. Well, I think the most important thing is trying to build consensus, because if there's so many different actors, then how to coordinate in the right way? The consensus should be the first step. Well, I would like to take the project implemented by ICDF, for example, because our projects always involve different partners, not only the recipient governments, also the local communities, or the local people. Different departments always involve the projects. So if we want to make sure the project could be implemented smoothly, we must integrate the multiple resources and to make sure that everyone on the same page. That's the only way that we can coordinate to make sure that everyone knows what we're going to do. Because we only take the issue seriously, everyone the same thought, then the issue could be resolved. Otherwise, everyone have their own interest, their own thoughts, their own angles. So we cannot proceed very well if there's no consensus being built. And also, for these issues, or say the women empowerment issues, we use the International Women's Initiative to connect the national and the local partners to raise the voice of women empowerment. And we're trying to invite INGO as the local NGOs to submit the proposals and of promoting how to promote the women empowerment. And in addition, we also organize a regional forum conference to collect suggestions and experience of the women empowerment. So building the consensus first, then we're trying to collect the suggestions on how to promote the issues. Then it is possible that we can move forward.
Thank you, Secretary General. Diane and Rachel, I'd like to give you a chance to chime in as well. Both of you are working in civil society organizations. Your thoughts on how we can better cooperate across this space to be effective. Go ahead, Diane, you first.
This is the question. This is so important because there's so many resources out there. There's so many different actors. And if we can really find a way to coordinate our efforts with the voice of the people we serve in the center, we are going to be much more successful and optimize the potential. How to do that, I think we're starting more and more to get there. I really appreciate USAID's co-creation model. And so I think it is about co-creating in a really efficient and effective way. And there are ways of doing that. And I think we're getting to the point where we're considering using some of these new ways of doing that. I mean, the internet offers us, like MIT's model of Theory U, where you can be co-creating and prototyping together. So we have the technology. Now we just need to open up our political will and get rid of our egos a bit and really put the people that we serve in the center of what we do and how we do it.
Thanks, Diane. And sorry to ask the $1 million question last. Usually don't save the hardest ones for last, but in this case, apparently I did. Over to you, Rachel, for your thoughts on cooperation and making cooperation more effective in these matters.
I mean, I fully agree that the people who are going to be benefiting or receiving support from these programs need to be at the center and have their sort of voices be the most important in the planning phase. But I do think in the planning phase of projects and programs, for example, bringing in various stakeholders, multi-sector people before a program gets executed, right, to be able to kind of have a more comprehensive and holistic view of how this is going to be executed and who are the main players, I think is important. So sort of the pre-planning before we do anything, I think is fundamental. And I think, I am happy to see USAID funding, more local initiatives, the Centro America Local, for example, funding. So I think diversifying where funds are going to be able to give civil society organizations and other organizations maybe more say and more ability to negotiate how they're going to be able to execute projects as well, and to be able to form more long-lasting and meaningful partnerships across sectors, I think is really important. So the diversifying of funding and having funding go directly to organizations, I think is a great initiative that I'm happy to see. So I think being able to disperse them to different actors and have them take the lead is great.
Tremendous. Thank you, Rachel. We've gotten a couple questions in the Q&A chat and a few questions on the online event webpage. So I'm going to move quickly into those with the time that we have remaining. And I want to ask one question about the Biden administration's approach to the Northern Triangle, because we've gotten about 4 or 5 questions through the combination of the website and the chat box about the root causes strategy. And so I'm going to take the moderator's privilege and just collapse those into one question and ask folks on the panel to comment on but the root causes strategy, which prioritizes 5 pillars to address the root causes of migration, economic insecurity, combating corruption and strengthening democratic governance, promoting respect for human rights, countering violence, and combating gender-based violence. Are there priorities missing from these 5 pillars? And also, I'd like to get the Secretary General's thoughts on how Taiwan and the United States might cooperate more deeply on these issues. But first, are there pillars that are missing, Madam Secretary, when it comes to the Biden administration's root causes strategy?
I think, well, the most important cooperation between Taiwan and US should be to improve the economic insecurity. Because now Taiwan is trying to work with all like-minded countries, let's say like the USA, and we're trying to work together to promote the women's economic empowerment. Probably first we can share our capacity building courses with the USA. And like we can share the information with the Academy for Women Entrepreneurs or the Young Leaders of American Initiatives. Because by sharing information, definitely they can come up with some ideas. Also, we can utilize the current established mechanisms in terms of the Global Cooperation and Training Framework, GCTF, which is a platform to utilize Taiwan's strengths and expertise to address global issues of mutual concern. So I think probably the GCTF will be a platform in the future to review the issues that we're talking about today. But for the furthermore, well, because we always mention the vocational training, and probably just we can broaden the scale of the trainings, we can expanding the programs for accommodating more women, vulnerable women to join the programs. And also we can come up with some financial service schemes, probably because we know the women, if want to stand up, first she must have skills. Then probably she needs some capitals to have a startup business, macro business. Then probably we can work with the US side to provide kind of micro loans to help the vulnerable women to have the capital to start their business. Well, enlarge the scale of the programs to have more women to receive the trainings, vocational training, equip them with the skills. Then we can give them some small loans. Definitely, it's going to broaden the issues and make probably solvable. So I think probably the way that we can work with the USA on this issue.
Thank you so much, Secretary General. Madam Secretary, Doctora Ana Leticia, I want to go to you and ask if you have any comments about the Biden administration's root causes strategy, which focuses on 5 pillars in Central America. Is there anything that, from your view on the ground, you would add to these 5 pillars, or do you think the root causes strategy encapsulates a lot of what needs to be done?
Creo que
I think that the strategy is very comprehensive for now. And I believe that what we have to do is more like target the topics we have been discussing. In economic security, if we don't keep in mind or take into consideration, and I emphasize the care environment, we're constructing a building that has a shaky or a loose foundation. We have to position the topic of care as an important element for economic security for women. And also, it's a matter of resilience. And what do I mean? I think it's important for these women, for these elements to incorporate the need to work in with more resilience factors in what Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador that we are exposed, particularly, and we have a high vulnerability to hydro meteorological problems, drought, ground problems, nutrition problems, the effects of from climate change, that we need to start working from a preventive approach when it comes to irregular migration. I believe it's really important to place the world agenda in towards global change into this specific agenda to identify the factors that are affecting these phenomena, the way they're affecting these women's lives, that they see their possibilities for the possibilities for family production being diminished, and also it increases domestic violence, human trafficking, sexual exploitation, and it becomes a factor of it brings it to resilience in care towards climate change and changes in the environment. I think that part is missing in this comprehensive perspective. The irregular immigration problem with women, and also to go further with this comprehensive perspective as an answer to the problem that is more and more linked to multiple factors. I believe that that's where we have an important answer. And basically, I think this could help us to identify what are the sectors, the areas, the territories where we have to place our view in preventing irregular migration and provide answers to women against these global climate problems that are becoming much more frequent and become humanitarian crises that create like bottlenecks. Yes, this sort of funnel-like effect in these in regular migrations, because they increase the pressure to the women that are to the increase of the pressure women already feel to migrate. And I think that's important to add to this strategy.
Thank you so much, Doctora Ana Leticia. Diane, I want to give you the last word, and we've had a really interesting question come into the chat box about engaging more women to run for office and political participation. And the question is, do you think that engaging more women to run for election and engaging more women to vote are also important parts of the strategy to move towards a stronger state of equality?
Absolutely. I think that we need both men and women involved as leaders and leading countries, leading organizations, and everywhere in the world we have less women leaders. in positions where we can make a difference. And we need both. We need both those energies. We need both those perspectives. And I think that our work in really instilling agency at a very young age and inviting opportunity is critical to really helping women offer the world what they have to offer in leadership. And I think it's so about time. And I think that we will see a shift in how, in many of these issues, as we have more and more women leaders. And I'm really looking forward to seeing that. And I know that's coming soon.
Thank you so much, Diane, and welcome back, Rachel. We're going to wrap up the event because I'm cognizant of the time. I want to thank everyone for taking your mornings to be with us. Secretary General, thank you for taking your evening to be with us. This was a really delightful event, and I think we covered a lot of ground, and I think it's pretty clear we could have gone on for a lot longer as well. So I want to thank all of you for being with us today. Doctora Ana Leticia Aguilar-Thiessen, Presidential Secretary for Women in Guatemala, Secretary General Timothy Xiang of the Taiwan International Cooperation and Development Fund, Diane Carrasas, the Regional Director for Latin America and the Caribbean at CARE, and Rachel Schmidtke, the Advocate for Latin America at Refugees International. Again, thank you so much for being here. Until next time, thank you.